Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're going back to our true crime roots, because as much as I love a good spooky story and haunted dolls, this is still a true crime podcast. And next week will be the super special episode that I've been alluding to all month long. But before next week's episode, let's get back to basics. And after next week's episode, we'll be back to full-fledged true crime cases all the time. So this week I'm diving into an exceptionally brutal case. And it's the case that I haven't seen covered very often, or at least not on the podcast and things that I typically listen to or read or watch or whatever. That's the case of Dylan Redwine, who went to visit his dad and just never returned home. So with all that being said, before I say let's get it, I wanted to ask one tiny favor of all my favorite listeners. I have officially made it in the podcasting industry as of Sunday. I have gotten my very first 1-star review, and I'm pretty sure that the same exact person went over to Spotify to make sure to leave me a 1-star rating there as well. Now, this 1-star review and rating was all because I said that Shanann Watts was involved in a pyramid scheme. And this person must have felt some type of way about it, because that was the entire 1-star review. That's what the whole thing was about. It wasn't about how many hours of research I'd put into that case, or even about how I did or said something that was wrong or untrue or whatever. No, it was simply because I said that Lavelle and Thrive seemed like a pyramid scheme to me. Which it does. So, if you have a minute, please go to rate me 5 stars on Apple and 5 stars on Spotify. That should help bring my now 4.9 and 4.8 star rating back up to 5 where it was before. So, whatever. All that being said, I'm here, I've made it. I officially have a hater, and that's fine. That's the only favor I need, so with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. Dylan Nicholas Redwine was born to his parents, Mark and Elaine Redwine, on February 6, 1991, and he grew up in Colorado with, of course, his parents, but Dylan also had an older brother by the name of Corey. Corey was 7 years older than Dylan, but despite the 7-year age gap between the two, they were extremely close when they were growing up. Corey would even later go on to describe his younger brother Dylan as his best friend, which isn't something I feel like is said often for siblings growing up together, and especially with a 7-year age gap. My two are 13 months apart, and they cannot stand each other. They hate each other's guts, but Dylan and Corey were the exception to that rule of thumb. Dylan and Corey's parents, Mark and Elaine, married in 1991 and then got divorced in 2007. After the divorce, Mark and Elaine shared split custody of Corey and Dylan. And I know that I would normally dig a little deeper into the background and the upbringing of the victims, which in this case is Dylan Redwine, but this case has enough twists and turns and curveballs to keep up with as it is. So with that being said, I did want to cover the bare basics of who the Redwines were as a family unit, because that's just as important. But from the interviews that I've watched of Corey talking about his younger brother Dylan, it almost seems like Corey was born to be an older brother. He absolutely loved it. And in one of those interviews, Corey recalled being 7 years old and being able to hold Dylan for the very first time as a newborn. Corey remembered how he felt getting to hold Dylan for the first time, and Corey says that he was just amazed with how small Dylan actually was, and he kind of studied his face and his little body. And then Corey says that he remembers how excited he was to be able to watch Dylan grow up, and how he couldn't wait to be able to watch Dylan learn how to do, simple things, like rolling over and walking. Corey was excited to be able to watch Dylan do just about anything. Now, after Mark and Elaine divorced, Mark started working as a long-haul trucker, and even though Mark and Elaine shared split custody of both boys, with Mark working as a long-haul trucker, Elaine would just kind of let Mark stop by and get the boys and see the boys whenever he could, since his schedule wasn't as set in stone as it may have been when they'd first come to their agreement to share custody. And this worked for the family for a time, because while Mark and Elaine lived in 2 separate houses in Colorado, they still lived within an 18 to 20 mile radius of one another. But it seems like after the divorce and after Mark started working as a long-haul trucker, that his relationship with Corey and Dylan kind of dwindled to a halt. Kind of like since Mark didn't have to worry so much about getting Corey and Dylan, and Elaine wasn't going to push their split custody agreement, that relationship between Mark and his sons kind of started to fade onto the back burner a little bit. And at this point, Mark and Corey's relationship was kind of non-existent. And this will make more sense as we get further into the details that come up after Dylan was reported missing. And while Mark and Corey's relationship was pretty much non-existent, Mark and Dylan still saw each other a couple of times a year. But when Dylan would visit with his dad, he would come home with like the newest toys, clothes, or gadgets, which kind of makes it seem like that's one of those relationships where one parent isn't involved in the day-to-day things, so they just try to kind of buy their kids love instead of worrying about spending time with them. They'd rather spend money than time. But that's just my opinion. We're allowed to have those. Now, sometime after Mark and Elaine divorced, Elaine started seeing a man by the name of Michael, who I'm just going to call Mike. And she would eventually go on to marry Mike, and the newlyweds would move to Monument, Colorado, which is near Colorado Springs. And of course, Corey and Dylan made this move with their mom and their new stepdad, Mike. And by the time that the move was made to Monument, Dylan was a teenager and Corey was a young adult. But Elaine had both Corey and Dylan full-time, with Mark only seeing them less than a handful of times a year. Now, something else that seems pretty relevant to mention here is that although Elaine had Dylan full-time and covered all of his expenses as far as clothes, shoes, school supplies, sport activities, and whatever else, Elaine was actually paying Mark child support, and for the life of me, I cannot make that make sense. And like most kids who have a parent that tries to buy their love instead of spending time with their kid, Dylan was getting old enough to see which parent had actually been there and which one actually cared about him in the way that a loving, caring, supportive parent should. And it was becoming more clear to Dylan that Elaine was that parent for him. And it was getting to a place where Dylan wasn't even really excited to go spend time with his dad anymore, no matter how many gifts Mark tried to shower Dylan with. But Dylan was supposed to be going to spend time with Mark, and to top it all off, Mark had bought a cabin in the middle of nowhere in Colorado that was more than an hour into the Colorado mountains. So currently in the timeline, we're in 2012, and it's time for Dylan to go spend Thanksgiving with his dad. He's going to go spend Thanksgiving with Mark in the middle of the woods in BFE. And from Mark's new cabin in the woods to Elaine's house near Colorado Springs, it was about 5 to 6 hours away. So this trip to visit with Mark wasn't going to be a quick ride down the road. And it was to the point now where Dylan was only really seeing Mark at all when it was court ordered that he absolutely had to go. And this Thanksgiving visit was court ordered, but this visit really only applied to Dylan because at the time Corey was 20 and Dylan was 13. So he wasn't quite old enough to have a say-so in the matter. So Corey wasn't being forced to see or spend time with Mark, but Dylan kinda was, which is probably one of the shittiest parts about being a teenager with divorced parents, or separated parents, or estranged parents, whatever. Because it's almost like your feelings aren't valid enough because you're not old enough to know, quote-unquote, what's best for you. But sadly, that's just how it goes. Around the time that Dylan went missing, Corey had kind of stepped in as a father figure for his younger brother, Dylan. Corey would pick Dylan up from ball practice and, take and pick him up from school, and he was kind of teaching him the ways of the world, the things that a father would normally do. And even though this Thanksgiving visit was court-ordered, Dylan had no problem voicing the fact that he did not want to go. Dylan wanted to stay home with his mom, his brother, his stepdad, and spend Thanksgiving like he normally did. Except this year, Dylan especially wanted to be at his mom's for Thanksgiving to be able to spend time with his grandma, who had recently been diagnosed with cancer. And Dylan's mom, Elaine, did reach out to her family lawyer to see if there was anything that she could do as Dylan's mom so that he wouldn't have to go to Mark's for Thanksgiving. And this wasn't a bitter baby mama trying to keep her kids away from their dad. This was just a mom trying to see if she had to force her son to go spend a holiday with someone that he did not want to spend time with. And Elaine's lawyer had even spoke to Dylan about why he didn't want to go to Mark's for Thanksgiving, and Dylan just kind of let the lawyer know that he didn't want to have to spend the holidays with his dad. But Elaine's lawyer basically told Elaine and Dylan that there really wasn't another option. That since this visit was court-ordered, that Dylan absolutely had to go. And if Dylan or Elaine didn't abide by the court order for Dylan to go, then that would have just led Elaine to being held in contempt of court. And that would have also been a way for Mark to use that against Elaine during future court proceedings if he chose to take it to court over a missed holiday visit. And honestly, no one was really willing to find out if Mark would take it that far or not over a visit. And it does kind of seem like Mark was pushing for this visit to happen, even though he knew Dylan wasn't really psyched about going. But no matter how badly Dylan didn't want to go, and no matter how much Dylan would rather be spending time with his grandma, who may not live to see another Thanksgiving, Dylan was forced to get on a plane to visit his dad for the Thanksgiving holiday. Elaine had purchased some kind of pass so that she could get into the gate terminal with Dylan since he was a minor, and Dylan and Elaine got some food together while she sat with him and they waited for his flight to board. And like I mentioned, this would have been like a 5 to 6 hour car ride from Elaine's to Mark's, so it would have been an even shorter plane ride. So on November 18th, 2012, Dylan Redwine boarded a plane for his dad, Mark's, and this would be the last time that Elaine would ever see her son again. Dylan was taking his plane trip to visit his dad for the holidays alone, and even though he didn't really want to go, I don't think anyone expected this to be the last time that Dylan would be seen alive, but it was. As Dylan walked away from Elaine to board the plane, Elaine asked if he was too old to tell his mom goodbye. So Dylan turned around, gave his mom a hug, told her that he loved her, and he boarded his flight. Elaine would later say that even though Dylan wasn't excited about going, and even though he had made it perfectly clear to everyone that he didn't want to have to go spend time with his dad, that she figured that Dylan would be at least safe because, he was at least with his dad. That's one of the few people that a child is supposed to be the safest with, is their parent. So once Dylan's plane landed, he was picked up by his dad, Mark Redwine, from the airport. And the airport was only about a 30-minute drive from where Mark actually lived. Elaine had gotten in touch with Dylan to check in and just make sure that he'd landed safely and that he had made it with his dad. Dylan responded to Elaine's text by telling his mom that yes, he had made it safely, but he also included a frowny face emoji at the end of his text. So if this doesn't scream, I don't want to be here, then I don't know what does. Obviously, Dylan's mood hadn't changed once he saw his dad and once he got back into the groove of being with the other parent. Dylan, at 13 years old, sent a sad face to his mom to let her know that he had in fact made it safely to his dad's house, but that he still did not want to be there. Now, from the airport, Mark and Dylan drove to their local Walmart and they picked up some things, and from there, Mark asked Dylan if he wanted to go to like a nicer sit-down type of restaurant. Dylan rejected the offer and told Mark that he'd rather just hit up a McDonald's drive-thru because he's 13 and they live on McDonald's. So that's what they did. And the surveillance camera footage of Mark and Dylan inside of the Walmart, you can see both of them there. So far, all of this tracks. Now, after Mark and Dylan finished at Walmart and they grabbed a bite to eat, they headed back to Mark's isolated cabin in the woods. And it seems like since Dylan didn't really want to have to spend time with his dad, Mark, that Dylan had kind of figured that he would use his time in Bayfield, Colorado, to catch up with his old friends that he had kept in touch with since he'd moved away after his mom remarried. So, sometime after Mark and Dylan got back from the airport and their few errands, Dylan asked his dad, Mark, if he could go spend the night with his best friend in Bayfield, Ryan Nava. And it seems like Ryan and Dylan had already kind of made these plans when Ryan told Dylan that he was coming into town for Thanksgiving. The only problem with this plan is that Dylan hadn't run those plans to spend the night with Ryan by his dad yet. But can we all just take a minute to acknowledge the fact that Dylan hasn't even been with his dad a few hours and he's already trying to get away from him? Like, Dylan had tried making these plans before his dad ever picked him up from the airport. I usually like to try to stay pretty unbiased in these cases, but this seems like a super unhealthy, probably toxic, for sure problematic father-son dynamic. I'm going to say that and leave it there. So, back to where we were in the timeline, Dylan did eventually ask permission to spend the night with Ryan, and Mark told Dylan no, he couldn't spend the night with Ryan that night. Which, let me play devil's advocate here for a minute also, and let's look at both perspectives. Mark had just picked his son up, so of course he tells him he can't spend the night with a friend. And I have an almost 12-year-old that is constantly trying to make plans to spend the night with other people, or for other people to spend the night with us. So Dylan wanting to spend the night with a friend on his first night in with his dad is either the biggest red flag or the most typical teenage thing ever. There is no in between there. But we also have to couple that with the fact that Dylan didn't want to go to Mark's in the first place. So there's also that. So back to where we were in the timeline. Dylan asked to spend the night with his buddy Ryan, and Mark shuts those plans down. So Dylan and Ryan come up with another plan instead. This new plan was that Dylan was going to go to Ryan's house the next morning at 6:30 a.m. And I don't know any 13-year-old who is willing to get up at 6:30 a.m. on a day with no school. So either the two boys had really missed being able to spend time together, or Dylan desperately wanted to get away from his dad, and we'll never really know which one it is. So the new plan was that Dylan was going to go to Ryan's house at 6:30 a.m. the very next morning. And Ryan was going to unlock the door for Dylan so that Dylan could come in without waking everybody in the house up. But Dylan hadn't only wanted to catch up with his best friend Ryan while he was back in town. He was also texting quite a few of his other friends from back home when he lived there before his mom got remarried. And if this doesn't show you what kind of kid Dylan was, then I don't know what to tell you. Dylan, who was 13 years old, had been able to keep in touch and remain just as close friends with the kids from his hometown even after so much time had passed. Dylan was the kind of kid that did not make short-term friends. He made friendships that would have lasted his entire lifetime if he had been given the chance to live his life. Now, one of the other friends that Dylan had been texting with from his hometown was a girl by the name of Amanda Saxton. And according to Amanda, the two had been texting about what shows they were watching, just really typical teenage things. And according to Amanda, the text from Dylan just kind of stopped all at once, and the last text that Dylan's cell phone records shows was a text from his mom asking how he was doing at about 10 p.m. on the same night that he had gotten off the plane to go to Mark's on November 18th, 2012. But Dylan never texted his mom back, and he never responded to any other text messages after that either. As a matter of fact, no one ever spoke to Dylan Redwine again. So what happened after Mark and Dylan came home from the airport after going to McDonald's and Walmart? Well, according to Mark, he and Dylan came back to the cabin and they tossed around a football. Mark says that he and Dylan then watched a movie that Mark had bought while they were at Walmart earlier in the day. And after the movie, Mark claims that Dylan was going to be sleeping on the couch and that Mark had gone to bed himself at around 9:30 or 10, but that Dylan was still awake when he went to bed. So after Mark called it a night, Mark kind of guessed that Dylan wouldn't be awake much longer after he himself had already gone to bed. So when the next morning rolled around, Dylan's best friend Ryan had texted Dylan asking him where he was at, because remember, Dylan was supposed to be showing up at Ryan's house at 6:30 in the morning. But Dylan never texted Ryan back, and he also never showed up at Ryan's house. And according to Mark, he says that he did try to wake Dylan up in order to drop him off at Ryan's house that morning on the 19th. But according to Mark, he says that he'd woken up kind of early that morning at 5:45 a.m. And Mark says that he knew that he was supposed to be taking Dylan to Ryan's house, and Mark even says that he tried to wake Dylan up. But he says that he couldn't get Dylan to wake up, and Mark says something really cringy like, you can't get him to go to bed, then you can't get him to wake up, or something. I don't know. It was really weird, really creepy sounding. So he can't get Dylan to wake up, so Mark says that he got dressed and got ready for the day, but that he still couldn't get Dylan awake and off the couch, even after trying a few times. So Mark just ended up leaving the house around 7:30 a.m. without Dylan. But side note here, Mark said that he knew that he was supposed to be taking Dylan to Ryan's house at 6:30. But then in that same breath, Mark also says that he didn't even try to wake Dylan up until 7:30. So which one is it? Because it can't be both. Especially since Mark himself says that he woke up at 5:45, which would have given him ample time to wake Dylan up and drop him off at Ryan's by 6:30. But let's continue. So Mark says that he left the house without Dylan at 7:30 a.m. and that he left the house to head to his office to meet with his lawyer. He was also supposed to be running a few errands while he was out. So at this point in Mark's timeline, Dylan is supposedly still at Mark's house on the couch and asleep. And after Mark left the house at 7:30 a.m. that morning, his cell phone records show that he texted Dylan 4 different times throughout the day on November 19th. A text was sent from Mark's phone at 8:14 a.m. to Dylan's phone, and this text from Mark basically just said, like, "Hey Dylan, I'm done at the office, give me a call." So that text came in at 8:14 a.m. And then Mark sent another text to Dylan's phone a minute later at 8:15 a.m. and it just kind of said, "Hey, please call me." And then at 11:23 a.m., Mark sent another text to Dylan's phone, and this text basically said, like, "Dylan, I'm home now. Where are you? You need to head back home, or you need to at least call me." And these are not direct quotes. This is just me paraphrasing. So Mark had made it back home from running errands or going to his lawyer's or whatever else he had left the house to do. So in these text messages, when you initially hear them, it sounds like Mark is just being a concerned dad. Like he hasn't spoken to his son at all since the night before, and he's starting to worry since he had gotten home and Dylan wasn't there, and now Dylan also wasn't responding to Mark's text. But according to Mark, when he had gotten back home at around 11:30, Dylan was gone with all of his stuff. And the door to Mark's cabin had been left open, there was a bowl of cereal sitting out on the counter, and the TV had been left on. The TV was left on playing the Nickelodeon channel. Dylan's backpack, his fishing poles, and his cell phone were all gone with Dylan. Mark says that after seeing all of this, that he kind of figured that Dylan had just left to meet up with one of his friends and maybe gone fishing since his fishing poles were gone also. So from here, Mark decided that he was just going to lay down and take a nap, so that's what he did. And when Mark woke up at around 1:30 p.m. and Dylan was still gone with all of his things, he waited until about 2:33 p.m. and he texted Dylan again, this time asking Dylan where he was and telling him that he needed to at least call him back. Mark had also tried calling Dylan a few times throughout the day too, and according to Mark, at 2:30 or 3, he left the cabin to go look for Dylan. Mark checked at a few of Dylan's friends' houses, and none of Dylan's friends had seen or spoken to Dylan since the night before, when Dylan had first landed and gotten to Mark's house. Mark claims that this is when he started to worry because not only had Dylan's friends not seen or spoken to Dylan all day long, but they had also been trying to get in touch with Dylan themselves. So at 4:32 p.m., Mark decided to text Dylan's mom, Elaine, just to see if maybe she had heard from Dylan. And of course, when Elaine gets a text that says like, "Hey, have you heard from Dylan? I don't know where he is," she immediately starts to panic. Elaine is 5 or 6 hours from Durango, where Dylan is supposed to be with Mark. And no, she had not heard from Dylan either. Dylan had been with Mark for less than 24 hours, and Mark was now telling Elaine that he did not know where Dylan was. Now, not long after Elaine got this text from Mark, Mark texted Elaine again, this time telling Elaine that he had just left the Bayfield Marshal's office, and Mark also says that he told the Marshal's office that he couldn't find Dylan. Elaine called the sheriff's office to try to report Dylan missing, and she also called the Bayfield Marshal's office where Mark said he had just left from, and she was only calling the Marshal's office to see what all was being done to help find Dylan. And from what Elaine was told, the Marshal's office hadn't spoken to anyone about a missing 13-year-old boy. So it almost seems like maybe Mark never actually went to the Marshal's office? Question mark. So naturally, Elaine jumps in her car with her husband and Dylan's stepdad Mike and Dylan's older brother Corey, and they're all headed to Durango. And I just realized that I've been going from Bayfield, Colorado to Durango, Colorado when I talk about where Mark lived, but they're really close neighboring towns, and a lot of this case takes place in both places. So I'm almost using them interchangeably here, don't come for me. So Elaine, her husband Mike, and Dylan's older brother Corey are all on their way to Durango to help look for Dylan. And I'm sure that the entire drive to Durango that Elaine was just kind of hoping and praying that maybe Dylan's phone had just died and that he would call or text at any time now. But he never did. Now, this drive up to Durango, Colorado, Elaine basically sent Mark a fuck your feelings kind of text, because her text to Mark read, "He wouldn't just leave, he would have called me. I am so suspect of you right now. How could he just disappear?" And honestly, I'm feeling the same way about this situation at this very moment. Elaine, Mark, and Corey all arrived in Durango, Colorado at about 11:30 or 12 p.m. on November 19th, 2012, which was just the day after Dylan had gone to Mark's. And when they arrived, there was still no sign or word from Dylan. No one had seen or spoken to Dylan since the night before when he'd first gotten to his dad's. Mark told everyone that when he'd first gotten home from running errands and he seen that Dylan was gone, that he had just kind of assumed that Dylan had walked to one of his friends' houses that lived close by. And when I say that maybe Dylan walked to a friend's house that lived close by, I mean this friend lived like 9 or 10 miles away from Mark's cabin. So now Mark is saying that he thought that maybe Dylan walked 9 or 10 miles to visit a friend in the winter in Colorado where it is cold as shit. Come on now, that don't even make no sense. Even Ryan, Dylan's best friend that he was supposed to be meeting up with that morning, hadn't spoken to Dylan since the night before when the two boys had initially made their plans for the next morning on the 19th, when Dylan never showed up. Ryan had even gotten up that morning when Dylan was supposed to be coming over to let Dylan in, and he just never showed up. But Dylan also wasn't responding to Ryan's calls or texts either. And Dylan wasn't the kind of friend to just bail on plans without a good reason or explanation. And Ryan had even texted Dylan earlier in the day to let him know that he was worrying Elaine with not responding to anyone's calls or texts. Basically, just letting Dylan know that he wasn't just worrying his dad Mark if that was his plan, that he was worrying everybody else too. But he still got no response. So Dylan's mom, stepdad, and brother all searched around Mark's house until about 2 a.m. that morning. But Mark wasn't out there helping to look for Dylan with the rest of the family because obviously he couldn't be bothered to lose out on any of his beauty sleep because Mark was actually in the cabin with all the lights off, sleeping like a baby. There were complete strangers walking around the Colorado mountains looking for his son while Mark was inside sleeping. Yeah, you heard me right. Police were brought in and a missing person search was launched. After Elaine assured investigators that Dylan would have never just run away, even as badly as he did not want to go to Mark's for Thanksgiving, he would have just called Elaine and had her come and get him, and they would have dealt with the court thing later. Now, one thing that everybody couldn't really get past was the fact that Dylan was a very typical 13-year-old boy. He was always on his phone, and all of a sudden, he just wasn't using his phone for an entire day. That seems unlikely at best. At some point, canine dogs, cadaver dogs, and police were all out searching the woods for Dylan, and Mark had given a pillowcase to one of the dog handlers for them to use to be able to track Dylan's scent. Mark said that this was the pillowcase that Dylan had slept on the night before, and that nothing else in the house would have had Dylan's scent on it because everything else that would have had Dylan's scent on it was gone with Dylan. But oddly enough, the dogs weren't able to pick up even Dylan's scent on that pillowcase. So, that's weird. That's suspicious. Mark also let officers know that Dylan's fishing poles were also gone from the house, so they immediately head to the nearby lake. Nothing was found near, in, or around the lake where he would have supposedly been fishing if that's where Dylan had actually gone. But according to Elaine, Dylan really wasn't familiar enough with fishing for him to just up and decide to go fishing alone by himself one day and not respond to anybody ever. Elaine says that Dylan didn't even know how to thread a fishing line, so this also seems unlikely. Now, once Elaine and Dylan's older brother Corey were actually in Durango and searching for Dylan, it became abundantly clear that Dylan wasn't just out of touch, that he was actually missing. And once they came to this realization, Elaine and Corey both immediately suspected Mark was somehow involved. Both Elaine and Corey knew about Mark's temper and his violent ways, so they were both looking straight at Mark for this. The FBI got involved in the search efforts, and complete strangers were out there on their hands and knees looking for Dylan with no luck and no help from Mark. Thanksgiving came and went without Dylan, and on November 24th, which was 6 days after Dylan was last seen, cadaver dogs did finally pick up on a scent near the lake. Divers were brought in, fancy search equipment was brought in, but nothing was ever found to suggest that Dylan was anywhere near where that scent was picked up from. Elaine, Corey, and Dylan's stepdad Mike all organized their own search efforts and started fundraising. And they weren't going to stop until they brought Dylan back home. A $50,000 reward was eventually put out for any information about where Dylan was or what had happened to him. The family used social media to their advantage, and on the 9th day of the search efforts to find Dylan Redwine, investigators believed that this was most likely a recovery search at this point, which had to be a hard conclusion to come to. So at this point, they don't think they're looking for a body or an injured body. They all just want to recover the deceased body. Now, Mark's house was finally searched 10 whole-ass days after Dylan was reported missing, because that's not plenty of time to get rid of evidence. And during the search of Mark's house, one of the investigators spotted what they thought was dried blood in the living room and on the couch, which Dylan supposedly slept on during his only night with Mark before he was reported missing. A quick spritz of luminol, and it was revealed that those spots were actually blood. Now, Mark explained this away by saying that the blood that was found in his house that belonged to Dylan was there because, duh, he was his dad, and that's fair to an extent. If investigators were to come and spray my house right now for my kids' blood, they'd probably find it in about 1,000 different places, from bike wrecks to skint knees to trampoline mishaps and what have you. But Dylan didn't live with Mark full-time, or even part-time. Dylan rarely even visited Mark at all, actually. Supposedly, Mark claimed that this blood came from a cold sore or a nosebleed or something of that nature. And then later on, it was a finger cut the day before. I mean, it was 1,000 different reasons why the blood was there, and none of them really seemed to make much sense. Now, 2 weeks after Dylan was last seen, there was still no trace of Dylan or any of his things for that matter. Not his clothes, not his shoes, not his toothbrush. Nothing was found. And there were over 50 different investigators running a task force, all in the hopes of finding Dylan. But no one could ever find any proof that Dylan had ever been with Mark at all. Aside from the Walmart surveillance footage, other than that footage of Mark and Dylan buying snacks at Walmart, though, there is literally no other sign pointing to the fact that Dylan had ever been at Mark's that day. And let me just say this. Elaine was not shy about telling the public that she thought that Mark was somehow involved in Dylan's disappearance. Mark was cooperative throughout the entire process at this point, though. Investigators took some carpet samples from Mark's rugs and carpets. They also took Mark's truck for further testing, along with all of his electronic devices. And Mark didn't seem to mind. He cooperated fully. Both Elaine and Mark were given polygraph tests during this time, and Mark himself says that he flunked the polygraph test pretty badly. Now, on February 4th in 2013, only 2 days before Dylan's 14th birthday, Elaine did an exclusive interview with KUSA to try to reach more people in the public and to make them aware of Dylan's case to try to help spread word about his missing persons case. And during this interview, Elaine said, quote, "It's not fair, you know? He's a 13-year-old boy. It's not fair that he's out there in this big old world with no one there to comfort him, no one there to reassure him that everything's going to be okay. That's my job, and somebody has taken that away from me. And that angers me. As it should, Elaine, as it should." Mark went on that same station, KUSA, the very next day after Elaine gave her interview. And during his interview, Mark claimed that he and Dylan were inseparable. They were thick as thieves. That Dylan would go to Mark about things before he would ever talk to Elaine about them. And I'm calling the biggest pile of bullshit on this statement. And that was actually a pretty good pun that'll make a lot more sense later on. Now, the investigators were still searching for Dylan's remains near and around Mark's cabin. And after these interviews, Mark, Elaine, and Corey all appeared on the Dr. Phil show in regards to Dylan's case. Now, on this episode of Dr. Phil, you'll hear Mark point the finger at Elaine about Dylan's disappearance, and you'll hear Corey and Elaine both point the finger at Mark. And it was during this episode on Dr. Phil that Corey just called Mark out in front of God, Dr. Phil, and everybody else who was watching. Corey blatantly says that he thinks that Mark killed Dylan, and he even goes into detail about how horribly Mark treated them as kids. He doesn't even refer to Mark as his dad, he just calls him Mark like a complete stranger would. And then Dr. Phil asked Mark if he would be willing to take another polygraph test on the show, and Mark agreed. So Dr. Phil was like, say less, and he brought in a polygraph expert, and just as Mark was supposed to be on the polygraph test behind the scenes, he all of a sudden backs out and won't take the test. And Mark even says at one point during this episode that this just wasn't a good time for him to be taking a polygraph test. So, when would be a good time, Mark? Asking for a friend. And Elaine made a really good point on this episode of Dr. Phil. She made the point that what 13-year-old cuts their phone off ever, at any point for any reason? And I'm not talking about having their phones on silent or vibrate or do not disturb. I'm talking about completely powering their phone all the way off for an entire day. I can't name one 13-year-old that would do that. Also, during this Dr. Phil episode, Elaine is asked if she thought that Mark had something to do with Dylan's disappearance, and she says something along the lines of, I would hope that I would have chosen to have kids with someone who wouldn't hurt our kids. But you can also just tell that she doesn't even believe what she's saying. But regardless of what anyone thought, Elaine, Mike, and Corey, and all of Dylan's other family members and friends never stopped searching. Investigators were still working Dylan's case and searching for his remains as well. And eventually, the weather put the searches on hold because doing searches like these, especially in some place like Colorado, you still have to make sure that the weather conditions are safe for the searchers to go out in. But when the weather warmed back up, the searches were picked right back up. And this search was going to be a huge search. It was going to be a 5-day search that spanned over the course of 12 miles of terrain. And this was 8 months after Dylan Redwine was last seen that the investigators finally found some sign of Dylan, and this was found during that 5-day, 12-mile search. The pieces of evidence that were found right off of a riding trail on Middle Mountain on June 26, 2013. They found a piece of a Chicago White Sox shirt, along with a piece of underwear, a sock, a Nike Jordan shoe that not only matched the size of Dylan's shoes, but was the same shoes that Dylan would have been wearing. They also found a pair of black corded earbuds. And before I tell you what else was found, let me just throw in this little fun fact, because I'm good at those. Middle Mountain Road, where all of these things were found, that road runs parallel to the road that Mark Redwine lives on. That's coincidental. Also, during this search, they were able to recover partial remains of Dylan Redwine, and they were later able to be confirmed to be Dylan. A tibia bone was found, along with a clavicle bone, and a fibula bone was also found. So, another interesting little bit of information about Middle Mountain Road, where Dylan's partial remains had been found, is that Elaine's husband, Mike, actually stopped on that road at one point earlier in the searches to use the restroom in the woods, and Mike actually saw Mark riding by. And this spot where Mike spotted Mark wasn't a spot that someone would be visiting, especially with the weather conditions being what they were at the time that he saw Mark there. When Mike saw Mark riding by, he thought it was kind of strange. It was kind of strange because Mark hadn't been helping with the searches. But Mark kind of just drove off like he didn't mean to be seen by Mike. And according to Mike, he said that when Mark saw him, that Mark left the area and drove down towards some more of the more heavily traveled roads in that area. And since Mark hadn't been helping in the search efforts for Dylan, what other reason would he have to be going down this road where the searches were in this isolated area? Which, good question, Mike. Good question, man. So, what does Mike do? He puts up hunting cameras in that area, like cameras that you would use if you were hunting for deer, pigs, turkey, etc. And he installed these game cameras all up and down alongside the roadway. And I just want to remind you who Mike is, because Mike is Dylan's stepdad. this is his stepdad making these moves. This is not his dad making these moves. This is his stepdad. This is Dylan's stepdad helping in the searches, staying up crazy hours into the night, checking every crease and crevice in that mountain looking for Dylan. Not his actual dad, his stepdad. Mark still wasn't helping in the searches, and they had been searching for months and months and months. But Mike was doing the damn thing. So back to the search where the partial remains were found. I just thought that was interesting, that little piece of information about Mike seeing Mark and then tracking him on hunting cameras. So these partial remains were found, but there were still more than 90% of Dylan's remains that were unaccounted for. But after these partial skeletal remains were found, that's the point that Dylan's case was switched from a missing persons case to a suspected homicide. After investigators were able to rule out the idea that maybe this was just an unfortunate wildlife attack, and when they were able to rule out the wildlife theory, that's when they were pretty sure that this was a full-blown murder. After this conclusion, investigators were able to kind of deduce that whoever was responsible for Dylan's murder had likely just dumped his body off the side of the riding trail on Middle Mountain and just kind of let Mother Nature take Dylan's remains wherever. And they were able to base this on where and how the remains, clothes, shoes, and etc. had been found. The clothes and shoes and earbuds were found a little ways away from the human remains, and at least now Dylan's family had some kind of answers. Even if those answers were heartbreaking, they at least knew that Dylan was deceased and not lost in the wilderness or being held captive somewhere. And with all of these new findings and the remains being found, Dylan's family was able to hold a celebration of life where his family and friends spoke about Dylan and what a kind, fun-loving, charismatic, full of life and love kind of kid that he was. And they were at least able to start their grieving process. Now, I listened to an audio recording of Mark talking about Dylan's remains being found and every bone and the placement of where each bone was found and where it goes, and Mark screwed all of them up. He was calling the bones by the wrong names and had no idea which bone was part of his son's foot, knee, shoulder, leg, anything. And I know that not all of us are familiar with every bone in the human body, but if something happened to your child and only 3 bones were found, I feel like you would have those bone names and their placements committed to memory. And maybe I'm just biased here because I don't like Mark, and you'll probably agree with me about that after we get to the conclusion of this case. But before we get to the arrest and the trial and Dylan's murder, let's talk about a few more shitty things that happened to Dylan and his older brother Corey when they were younger. And these things are the reason why Corey was convinced that Mark had something to do with Dylan's disappearance. When Corey was just 14 years old, he was kind of rummaging through his dad's stuff during a visit like a lot of teenagers do, when he found a Ryobi brand tool bag on the top shelf in one of the closets at his dad Mark's house. When Corey pulled down the bag and he opened it, the tool bag was filled with lacy women's underwears, brass knuckles, guns, and beautifully printed bras. After some more digging and rummaging, Corey found some magazines with some pretty taboo things in them. And these things may have only been taboo because he was just 14. So the things that were found were probably more like fetish types of things, but we'll get back to the fetish stuff. Something else that Corey talked about in an interview was something that Mark had done to Elaine when they were in the process of getting a divorce. Mark would take one of each of Elaine's shoes, so she would never have a whole pair of shoes, which seems more like an inconvenience than anything else, to be honest. And Corey says that some of the other things that Mark would do are things that Corey thought were just normal until he got older. And then he realized that not everyone's dad did things like his dad. For example, the cruel and unusual way that Mark would parent the boys. Like if the boys didn't finish their plate of food and they threw away what they didn't eat, they threw it into the trash. Mark would make the boys dig through the trash and pull out and then eat any of the food that they hadn't finished, even if they had already thrown the food into the trash. The boys would have to learn how to get rid of any extra food that they didn't eat, and they would do things to keep Mark from realizing that they had thrown food away, because it didn't matter to Mark what had gone into the trash after they'd thrown food away, and it didn't matter what had gotten on the food while it was in the trash. They would still be forced to eat it. And Corey says that it wasn't until he was much, much older that he realized that not every kid grew up eating food that they'd thrown away out of a trash can. But it was actually Dylan who was the one who discovered one of Mark's biggest secrets, and it's nothing compared to the bras and lacy underwear that Corey found when he was a teenager. In 2011, Mark, Corey, and Dylan all went on a road trip together, and it was on this road trip that Corey and Dylan would see a completely different side of their dad. During this trip, Corey was outside on the phone with his wife telling her goodnight, and it was about 11 p.m. when Corey hung up with his wife for the night. And when Corey went back into where Dylan was inside, Dylan was looking at something on a laptop and telling Corey that he had to come and look at this because he just had to show him what he'd found on this laptop. So when Corey walks over to see what Dylan is going on and on about, the laptop screen is covered in pictures of their dad, Mark. And in those pictures, Mark is dressed in a cloth diaper, wearing a baby bonnet, but that wasn't even the most disturbing part, though. Because Corey made Dylan go into the bathroom with him and take the laptop with them, and the two scrolled through the pictures. Mark wasn't only wearing the baby bonnet and the cloth diaper, he had actually defecated in the diaper while it was strapped around his waist. And in the next few pictures, Mark could be seen eating his own stool out of the diaper. I'm sorry, I really wasn't sure how to word this without making everybody sick. But there were pictures on the laptop of the dirty diaper in Mark's mouth, and I would almost be willing to bet that he was eating his own stool. So that's gross. And you can actually find some of these pictures if you do a quick Google search. My stomach just ain't built like that anymore, so I'm going to pass, but you have at it. So they found these pictures on Mark's laptop, and Corey pulls out his flip phone, and he takes pictures, of the laptop screen. So essentially, Corey is taking a picture of a picture. There were more pictures on the laptop of Mark wearing women's dresses, high-heeled shoes, wigs, earrings, which, go off, queen. But I just can't get behind the eating your own stool. I'm not even kink shaming. I'm just saying that bowel movements are your body's way of getting rid of its own toxic waste. So, it's probably not healthy for you to be ingesting it again. But I'm also not a doctor, so what do I know? And all of these pictures had been taken inside of Mark's house, which kind of puts into perspective maybe why Mark wanted to live out in the middle of nowhere. So Corey and Dylan both knew about these pictures, but they never told their mom Elaine, and they never talked about it to anyone else besides each other. Corey snapped a few pictures on his flip phone, and he told Dylan to put the laptop back exactly where he had found it, and he instructed Dylan not to speak a word about this to their dad, Mark. And Corey warned Dylan about bringing up these pictures to Mark because Corey knew that Dylan wasn't old enough to be able to legally choose whether or not he wanted to be around Mark, and that it would probably just make what time Dylan did have to spend with Mark more problematic. Now, on a different trip that Dylan went on with Mark, alone this time without Corey, Dylan texted Corey over and over and over, begging Corey to send him the quote-unquote poop pictures of their dad. Dylan actually texted Corey asking him to send him those pictures 7 different times. And Corey never would send the pictures to Dylan, no matter how hard Dylan tried to talk him into it. And I guess Corey finally asked Dylan why he even wanted the pictures. And Dylan said that Mark was lecturing him about what a bad influence their mom Elaine was. And that Mark was going on and on about all of these things that he didn't agree with that Elaine did. And Dylan basically said that he wanted to show Mark these pictures just to be able to ask him which adult was really the bad influence. This trip that Dylan went on with Mark without Corey was in August of 2012, which was only 3 months before Dylan was reported missing. But after Dylan went missing, Corey wondered if Dylan had maybe used those pictures as a means of blackmail. He wondered if maybe Dylan had threatened to show these pictures of Mark to everybody if Mark kept making him come to visit for the holidays. And no one really knows if that's what happened or not, but if Mark is as bad as Corey recalls, then I could definitely see it escalating if Dylan did bring up those pictures. Because we do know that somehow Dylan did end up with a copy of those quote-unquote poop pictures. We just don't know how he got them, because Corey refused to send them to him or give them to Dylan. But Corey does say that every time that Dylan felt any kind of anger or resentment towards Mark, that Dylan would always threaten to throw up those pictures in Mark's face. These pictures had kind of became Dylan's go-to thing when he was mad or upset with Mark. And at the time that Dylan went missing, Mark and Corey weren't even on speaking terms because of some texts that had been sent back and forth between the two. And the text exchange between Mark and Corey was Mark sending Corey a picture of a mess that Corey had left behind after a visit, and Corey just responded with a picture of Mark eating his own shit. And he basically told Mark that he could send pictures of messes too, also throwing in that you are what you eat, and telling Mark that he thought he was a disgusting human being. Mark then responded to Corey and asked him not to send those pictures to Dylan because Mark said he wanted to try to salvage at least one of the relationships between his sons. Because Mark also had another son with a different woman named Brandon, and Mark and Brandon also weren't on speaking terms either, even though Brandon did put their differences to the side to come and help search for Dylan when he was first reported missing. So obviously, if Corey and Mark aren't on speaking terms, and Brandon and Mark also aren't on speaking terms, and Dylan didn't want to go spend time with Mark, the common denominator there is Mark. Normally, if it seems like everybody else is the problem, it's usually you. So obviously, at this point that Dylan was reported missing, Mark still believed that Dylan didn't know about the pictures, or he wouldn't have been asking Corey not to send them to Dylan. But let's jump back into the searches for the rest of Dylan's remains, because after finding these pieces of clothes and these few bones, nothing else was found for almost 3 years. That was until November of 2015, when a married couple were out hiking on a date. The couple had been hiking near the river where everyone had initially been searching for Dylan at. The couple picnicked and hiked along the trails and took in some of the mountain views. When the husband stumbled across something, he walked it over to show his wife, and she immediately knew what it was. It was a human skull. It was actually just a partial skull, but a skull nonetheless, and they put their date on pause, obviously, and alerted authorities. So what was left of the skull was tested and determined to be Dylan. The skull was taken in for analysis by a coroner and a forensic anthropologist, and when the skull was analyzed, it was determined that some sort of sharp instrument had been used to puncture the skull. They were also able to determine that the skull had been punctured while the blood surrounding the skull was still wet, which led them to believe that these puncture wounds likely happened while Dylan was still alive. Either that or they happened very shortly after Dylan was killed. They were also able to determine that Dylan had suffered from a skull fracture due to blunt force trauma. They were never able to determine the actual cause of death because there wasn't enough of Dylan's remains found. And because the remains that had been there so long after he'd been murdered. Kind of made it hard. And remember the blood that was found in Mark's house that belonged to Dylan? Well, this led me to assume that blunt force trauma to the skull would result in probably a lot of blood loss. But actually, it's pretty normal not to bleed at all when blunt force trauma is involved. So maybe those few spots were actually from blunt force trauma, which would explain why it was such small amounts of blood that were found. The place where the skull was found by the hiking couple is about 15 miles away from Mark's cabin if you were to drive the distance. But if you were to look at it from a bird's eye view overhead from the sky, it's only about 3 or 4 miles. But according to Dylan's older brother, Corey, he says that if you were to walk about 100 feet away from where Dylan's skull was found, that you would actually be able to see Mark's house from there. So 100 feet from where Dylan's skull was found, you could clearly see Mark's house. Almost like maybe, just maybe, the skull was put there on purpose. Now, after this, Mark was officially and formally named as a suspect in the murder of his son, Dylan Redwine. Police were still collecting evidence, and everyone who knew Dylan personally were also starting to think that it had to have been Mark. But police weren't going to make an arrest until they had enough evidence to hopefully get a conviction in a trial. No one wanted a chance an acquittal or the chance of there being a mistrial or a hung jury. Now, after Mark was officially named a suspect, the investigation was still on. Cadaver dogs were brought in again, and this time, They alerted to the scent of human remains being in contact with Mark's clothes, his house, and his truck. So, how is this not a big red flag? I get it. You want more red flags, right? Okay, don't worry, because I got you. Mark's ex-wife Betsy had also come forward to the police and to a major news station in the area, and when Betsy was asked if she thought Mark was involved in Dylan's murder, she didn't even hesitate. She simply said, quote, "Absolutely, he's violent." Now, Mark's ex-wife Betsy was another person who thought that Mark was involved as soon as she heard the news about Dylan being missing. So it wasn't just Elaine and Corey, it was quite a few people who knew Mark and who knew how violent he could be. On November 19th, 2012, the day after Dylan had gotten to Mark's house for his Thanksgiving holiday, a former co-worker came forward to let police know that they recalled that Mark was acting pretty strangely on that day. Yes, on the same day that Mark had supposedly left Dylan asleep on the couch to come back later to him being gone, to then him being missing. So this former co-worker says that Mark came in talking about one of his sons, but he didn't say exactly which son he was talking about. And the co-worker only found this strange because Mark had never talked about his kids or his personal life at all at work up to this point. And now all of a sudden, he's blabbing on and on to a co-worker about his son. So this co-worker thought that it was weird, but he didn't really think anything else about it until later on that day when the whole town was out searching for Dylan. And then Mark's oldest son from his first marriage, Brandon, he had also talked to Mark the day after the first few bones had been discovered, and Brandon just remembered that Mark had brought up and used the term blunt force trauma more times than he could count during that conversation. Mark even told his oldest son, Brandon, during this same conversation that the police would have to find Dylan's skull in order to determine the cause of death. Which is weird. You gotta say it, it's weird. Another thing that made Mark's first wife feel like she needed to report her suspicions after Dylan's partial remains were found is that Mark had actually told Betsy before that he would kill their kids before he let her get full custody of them. Betsy also says that Mark has always been the type of person who would just kind of disregard their custody agreements. So Mark's looking like a pretty good candidate for this crime. But since Dylan's remains were found scattered around like they were, investigators don't believe that wild animals were involved. The first few bones were found 6 miles away from where Dylan's skull was found, which makes it less likely to have been an animal. And Corey believes that Mark probably took a few different trips up into the mountains where the remains have been found, and he thinks that he probably did this over the course of the entire case being investigated. He believes that Mark most likely moved small pieces of Dylan's remains a little at a time in an attempt to try to make it look like an animal attack, maybe to try to trick investigators into thinking that animals had dragged Dylan's body parts into the thickest parts of the mountains. And Corey also believes that on November 19th, when Mark was supposedly out running errands, that Mark had stopped at all the public trash cans and dumpsters to throw away Dylan's belongings and bags and anything else that Dylan had taken with him to Mark's house, because Dylan's cell phone, wallet, and all of his other personal belongings have still never been found. But police weren't letting this case just fall by the wayside. It may have taken longer than what they wanted to get the evidence that they needed to make an arrest, but they waited. And finally, on July 20th, 2017, all of the evidence was presented to a grand jury, and an arrest warrant was finally issued for Mark Redwine on one count of second-degree murder. 2 days after the grand jury convened on July 22nd, 2017, Mark was pulled over in a traffic stop where police had been waiting and on the lookout for Mark Redwine's big truck, so when they spotted him, they stopped him and Mark was finally arrested in connection to his son, Dylan Redwine's murder. When Mark was pulled over and told that he was being arrested, you can actually hear him say something along the lines of, "I don't know what this is in relation to." So Mark claimed to not know anything about the second-degree murder charge or the child abuse charge, and he was just so confused on why he was being arrested. When Mark was finally arrested, Elaine just said that she was glad that there was finally an arrest being made, and that she had been looking at Mark for this the whole time. Dylan was reported missing and disappeared in 2012, and when Mark was formally arrested, it wasn't until 2017. Mark was originally set to go to trial in 2018, but it was rescheduled so that the judge had time to review the case file and to be caught up to speed. So then the trial was set to start in September of 2019. But this court date would also have to be pushed back even further. But do you want to take a guess, a gander, if you will, on why this court date had to be pushed back? Well, I'll tell you. Because Mark's attorney had been arrested for domestic violence and assault charges. So that tracks, I guess. I guess sometimes you are the company you keep. So this time, the trial was scheduled for April of 2020. But then, thanks to good old COVID-19, the trial had to be pushed back again to November of 2020. And then right before the trial was set to start in November of 2020, it had to be postponed yet again because the judge started showing signs of COVID. Now, this time the trial was put on hold while the judge's COVID test results were kind of in limbo, and after it was set to start again, 2 of Mark's own attorneys started showing signs and symptoms of COVID, so the judge decided to just do a mistrial instead of putting this trial off again. And then finally, in January of 2021, the trial was set to begin with no hiccups this time. So the trial ended in July of 2021, almost 10 years after Dylan went missing from his dad's house on a Thanksgiving holiday. After the jury deliberated, they finally came back with a guilty verdict for Mark Redwine. Mark was found guilty on the charge of second-degree murder and the charge of child abuse resulting in death. Mark Redwine was then sentenced to the maximum punishment, with the judge giving Mark as much prison time as he could legally serve, which ended up resulting in a sentence of 48 years in prison. And even after the trial and the guilty verdict, Mark has still never, not once, taken responsibility for Dylan's murder. But Dylan finally got the justice that his family waited almost an entire decade for, and that's really all that matters. And that's all I have for you this week, so let's do a review of the week and let's get out of here. This week, I'm reading the 1-star review because it obviously bothered her enough to take the time to write a review, so I will in turn take the time to read the review. This review is from Podcast Girl, and it is a 1-star review with the caption that says, "Whoa." The rest of it reads, "Maybe you should learn what a quote-unquote pyramid scheme actually is, because pyramid schemes are literally against the law and wouldn't be backed by the FTC like Lavelle is. Just because you had a couple of bad experiences with your companies doesn't mean those were pyramid schemes either." Shaking my head. Thank you for the review, girl. I love y'all. See you next week. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.